Malik Johnson walked into St. Grace Hospital alone. He had his younger son's medical folder tucked under one arm, a half-empty coffee cup in the other hand, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from 3 years of bad nights stacked on top of each other. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed the way they always did. Too bright, too steady, indifferent to whoever passed beneath them. A nurse had pointed him toward the 3rd floor. He nodded, thanked her, and turned left when she meant right. He walked past the elevator, past the water fountain, past a cart of folded blankets no one had put away yet. Then he stopped in front of room 319. He didn't know the number was wrong. He pushed the door open the way a tired man opens a door, without ceremony, without expectation, and stepped inside. She was lying in the bed closest to the window. Thin, pale in the way that has nothing to do with skin tone and everything to do with the body slowly running out of something it needs. Tubes ran from her arm to a machine that beeped in a rhythm too slow for comfort. The chair beside her bed was empty. The surface of her nightstand held nothing but a plastic cup of water and a call button she hadn't pressed. She looked at him the way people look at something they've stopped believing in. He opened his mouth to apologize and leave. Then she said quietly, without accusation, that he didn't have to rush. That it had been a long time since anyone had walked through that door without coming to check a number or deliver bad news. Malik Johnson stood in the doorway of room 319 with his son's medical folder under his arm and said nothing for a moment. He did not leave. 11 months later, he married her. If you've ever believed that the wrong turn can lead you somewhere you were always meant to be, stay with this story. Malik Johnson was 37 years old and had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 3. Grown up in the foster care system. 7 different homes before she turned 18. She'd learned early that attachment was a liability. People left, or they asked you to leave, and the ones who stayed usually wanted something in return. She'd built a life as a graphic designer, working remotely, keeping her world small and manageable. Acquaintances, not friends. Routines, not relationships. When she got sick enough to be hospitalized, the absence of people in her life became something visible. The nurses noticed. The social worker on rotation noticed. Grace noticed too. The way you notice a shadow that's always been there once the light changes. She had stopped fighting it. On the morning Malik walked into her room, the attending nurse had come in carrying a new medication adjustment. Grace had looked at the pills in the small plastic cup and asked quietly how long it would take if she stopped taking them altogether. The nurse smiled and launched into a careful explanation of adjustment periods and what Grace could expect over the next 2 weeks. Grace nodded and said nothing more. She was not asking about the adjustment period. Malik had been told to go to room 391. He had been awake since 5:30. He had spent 40 minutes in a waiting room watching a television mounted too high on the wall before a nurse told him Noah's results weren't at the front desk, but with the attending physician on the 3rd floor. He took the stairs because the elevator was slow. He turned left because the signage was confusing and he was tired and not thinking carefully. He walked down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old carpet and stopped in front of a door marked 319. Then he pushed it open. Grace looked up from the bed. She had been staring at the ceiling, which was what she did when there was nothing else to look at, which was most of the time. She saw a tall black man in a gray jacket holding a manila envelope, wearing the expression of one who had just realized he'd made a mistake but hadn't decided what to do about it. Malik said, "I'm sorry. I think I have the wrong room." Grace said, "You probably do." He started to step back. His hand was still on the door. Then Grace said, without planning to, "You don't have to rush. It's been a while since anyone came in here without a clipboard." Malik stopped. He looked at her, not at her chart, not at the machines, not at the tubes running from her arm, at her, the way you look at a person when you're actually paying attention. And Grace, who had not been looked at like that in longer than she could easily remember, felt something shift. Malik thought about Renee, about the last week she had spent in a hospital bed after the accident before she was gone, about how he had sat beside her and thought over and over that he wished there were more people in the room, more voices, more presence, more proof that she was known by the world. He pulled the chair away from the wall and sat down. "I've got a few minutes," he said. He meant to stay 5 minutes. He stayed 50. He told her about Noah first. 8 years old. Suspected arrhythmia. Probably nothing serious. But Malik had been living in the probably nothing space for 3 years and knew exactly how much weight that word carried. He told her about Ava hiding socks in her toy microwave because she thought they needed to be warm. And about the morning Ava had microwaved an actual sock in the actual microwave, and the smell had gotten into everything for 3 days. Grace laughed. Not a polite laugh. The kind that catches you off guard because your body produces it before your defenses go up. She pressed her hand over her mouth afterward like she'd forgotten she was capable of it. Malik noticed. He kept talking. By the time he left, he had missed his window to collect Noah's test results and would have to call the doctor's office in the morning. He walked through the corridor and out into the parking lot and sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine. He thought about the empty chair beside her bed, the cup of water with nothing next to it, the way she had looked at him when he first walked in, like she had made a quiet, private peace with the fact that no one was coming, and the way that look had slowly changed over the 50 minutes he'd spent in that chair. He started the car and pulled out of the lot. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He knew before he'd reached the street that he was lying. He went back the next day. He brought soup from the diner 2 blocks from his apartment. Chicken, definitely not homemade, and told her he'd made too much. Grace looked at the container, then at him, and said, "You don't strike me as someone who makes soup." "I make great soup," Malik said. "That's a very specific lie," she said, and took it anyway. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. He started timing his visits around his delivery routes, rearranging his schedule in small ways he didn't examine too closely. He brought things. A paperback he'd finished and thought she might like. A crossword book. And once, a small succulent in a plastic pot, because Ava had insisted plants made people feel better, and he hadn't known how to argue with a 5-year-old certainty. Grace kept the succulent on the windowsill. The nurses noticed the change in her. She was eating more consistently, taking her medications on schedule, asking her doctors more specific questions about her treatment plan. The flatness that had been in her voice the first day, the tone of someone narrating their own life from a distance, had changed. She argued with him about the paperback he'd brought. She had opinions. She told him with complete seriousness that his taste in fiction was pedestrian. And he told her that was rich coming from someone who'd been staring at a hospital ceiling for 2 weeks. She laughed. Again, more easily this time. But the closer Malik felt himself getting, the more a familiar dread settled in his chest. He recognized the feeling. It was the same feeling he'd had in the early months with Renee, when things were good and he knew they were good, and knowing made him afraid of what it would cost to lose them. He had lost them. He sat at the kitchen table one night after the kids were asleep and told himself, with some firmness, that this was different. Grace was a patient. He was a man who had stumbled into her room by accident. Whatever warmth he felt was compassion, human decency, nothing more. He believed this for approximately 3 days. It was Noah who undid him. Malik had been mentioning his hospital visits to the kids in small, shapeless ways. Not everything, just references. The way you mention a neighbor you've started waving to. "There's a woman at the hospital. She's been sick a long time. I sit with her sometimes." He kept it light. He kept it vague. One evening, Noah looked up from his homework and asked if the woman at the hospital was scared. Malik paused. "What do you mean?" "Being sick," Noah said. "Being there by herself." "Is she scared?" Malik thought about Grace's face the first day. What was in it? And what was missing from it? "I think she was," he said carefully. "Maybe less now." Noah nodded the slow, deliberate way he nodded when he was turning something over. Then he went back to his homework. The next morning, Ava came downstairs with a drawing. She had used every crayon in the box. There was a house, green grass, a yellow sun, for standing figures, 2 tall, 2 small, and a 5th figure lying in what was clearly meant to be a bed, with brown hair and a red blanket and a small careful smile. "That's our family," Ava said, pointing to the 4 standing figures. Then she pointed to the 5th. "And that's the sick lady. She can be in our family too." Malik looked at the drawing for a long moment. "She doesn't have anybody," Ava said with the uncomplicated logic of a 5-year-old. "So we can be her anybody." He took both kids to the hospital that Saturday. He had told himself he wouldn't. He'd gone back and forth about it for 4 days. Noah was still sensitive about his mother. Ava got attached to everyone. Grace was terminally ill. This was not a situation with a safe outcome for anyone, least of all 2 children who had already lost one parent. But Ava's drawing was on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a pineapple. And every time he walked past it, he thought about Grace in room 319 with her cup of water and her unanswered question to the nurse. He brought them on a Saturday afternoon. Noah wore his good jacket without being asked. Ava carried her drawing rolled up in her fist like a diploma. When they walked into room 319, Grace looked at the doorway and went very still. Ava walked directly to the wall beside the window and unrolled the drawing. "I made this for you," she said. "That's you in the bed. You're smiling because we're there." Grace's mouth opened slightly. Noah pulled the chair close to the bed, sat down, and opened the chapter book he'd brought. "I'll read to you if you want," he said. "I'm a good reader." Not with arrogance, just as a statement of fact. Grace looked at Malik, who was standing near the door with his hands in his jacket pockets, not entirely sure this had been a good idea. Then she looked at Noah, and at Ava, who was asking a passing nurse for tape so she could put the drawing on the wall properly. And something in Grace's face changed in a way that was impossible to miss. It was the look of someone who had just made a decision quietly in some interior room they didn't know they still had access to. To still be here. She cried. She turned toward the window first, but Noah noticed. He reached over and put his hand on her arm the way Malik had done for him on hard nights and said, "It's okay. We're not going anywhere." Grace pressed her hand over his and nodded. On the way home, Ava fell asleep in her car seat. Noah looked out the window for a long time before he said, "She needed us more than we needed to protect ourselves from being sad." Malik glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Mom used to say that," Noah said, "that sometimes you have to walk toward the sad thing instead of away from it." Malik drove the rest of the way home without speaking. But something had shifted in him. The way furniture shifts in a room after a long time. You can't point to what moved exactly. The space just feels different. 3 weeks later, Grace's doctor told her she was stable enough to be discharged. Stable did not mean well. It meant her condition had plateaued at a level that no longer required constant hospital monitoring. She would need daily medication management, dietary restrictions, limited physical exertion, regular follow-up appointments, and someone present in the home in case of an episode. Without a capable caregiver in a home setting, Grace would be transferred to a long-term care facility. There was one with an opening 40 miles away. Clean. Professional. A private room. Grace said that sounded fine. The social worker looked at her with the careful expression of someone who understood what fine meant when a person said it like that. Malik found out from Grace herself that evening. Delivered in the same flat tone she'd used the first day. The voice she only used now when she was trying not to feel something. He drove home. He put the kids to bed. Then he sat at the kitchen table and did the math. His income, his hours, his bandwidth, the disruptions to the kids' routine, the medical costs, the reality that Grace's condition was not going to improve to the point of full independence. The math didn't work. It didn't work cleanly, anyway. He asked the kids in the morning, not to put the decision on them, but because he believed they had a right to be part of it. Noah said, "Mom always said we weren't rich, but we could still be decent." Ava said, "If she doesn't have a home, why can't she just live at ours?" Malik looked at his daughter, 5 years old, syrup on her shirt, shoes already on the wrong feet, and thought about how much easier it was to be certain when you hadn't yet learned all the reasons to be afraid. He went back to the hospital the next day and told Grace she was coming home with them. Grace said no. He told her again. She said he was being reckless. He told her he had 2 kids who had already voted and he was outnumbered. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "You don't owe me anything." "I know," Malik said. "That's not what this is." The first weeks were hard in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Grace had good days and bad days. And the bad days were bad. Mornings she couldn't get out of bed without help. Afternoons when the pain was bad enough that she went quiet and the house filled with a particular tension. Not of conflict, but of waiting. Malik learned to read her breathing. He learned which medications needed food and which didn't. He learned she slept better with a fan on. That she didn't like to be asked how she was feeling when she already knew the answer was not good. And that she preferred being spoken to normally rather than carefully. As a person, not a condition. There were nights he sat in the kitchen at 11 and felt the exhaustion of caring too much for too long. There were nights he put his face in his hands and just sat there for a while. Not crying, just inhabiting the weight of it. But Grace changed the quality of the house in ways he hadn't expected. She helped Noah with his reading comprehension, asking questions that made him think rather than just summarize. She taught Ava to draw sunflowers in stages. Center first, then petals, then shading. And Ava's sunflowers went up on the refrigerator beside her original drawing of the family. She told both kids stories before bed when Malik was running late. Not fairy tales, but invented ones. About a girl who could talk to clouds and a boy who kept a map of everywhere he'd ever been happy. The house, which had been running on routine and necessity since Renee died, started to feel inhabited again. Malik noticed it at odd moments. At the sound of Grace's voice carrying from the kids' room. At the sight of her reading glasses left on the kitchen table. At the way Ava had started narrating her drawings to Grace, first before anyone else. He noticed it, and he let himself notice it, which was its own kind of progress. For months after Grace moved in, Malik knew he was in love with her. He didn't say it. He told himself she would think it was pity or obligation or some complicated grief displacement. He told himself the timing was wrong. The circumstances were wrong. That staying steady was the kindest thing he could do. Grace had reached the same place from the opposite direction. She knew she loved him. She loved Noah and Ava with a completeness that surprised her. She, who had spent her whole life keeping people at careful distance. But love, in her experience, was something that cost the other person. She was running on borrowed time with a damaged heart. She would leave. And when she did, Malik would be left with two children who had already lost their mother, now learning to lose someone else. She decided she would spare them that. On a Thursday morning in February, while Malik was on his delivery route and the kids were at school, Grace called the long-term care facility and asked if they still had a bed available. They did. She got a notepad and began writing down the items she'd need packed. Malik came home at 9:15 and found her at the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the notepad. Then he looked at her. "Grace," he said. She didn't look up immediately. "I've thought about this carefully. It's the right decision. For the kids mostly. They're getting too attached." "They're already attached," Malik said. "So am I." She looked up then. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. "I know you're doing this because you think it protects us," he said. "But you leaving doesn't protect us. It just means we lose you sooner and we don't get any of the time in between." "You don't know what you're asking for," Grace said. "I know exactly what I'm asking for. I've done this before. I know what loss looks like. And I'm telling you, I would rather have you here for however long that is than not have you at all." "I'm not Renee," Grace said, and her voice caught on the name. "No," Malik said. "You're not. And I'm not asking you to be." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because I love you. And because my kids love you. And because I think you love us too. And you're about to walk away from the only family you've ever had because you're scared of what it'll cost us. And I'm telling you that you don't get to make that decision for us." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator hummed. Ava's sunflower drawings shifted slightly in the draft from the heater. Grace pressed her fingers over her eyes. "I love you," she said finally. "I love all of you. And I'm terrified." "Me too," Malik said. She didn't go. 6 weeks after Grace stayed, she nearly didn't make it through the night. It was a Wednesday in late March, close to midnight. Malik had been asleep for maybe an hour when he heard a sound from down the hall. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong in the way certain sounds are wrong at certain hours. He was out of bed before he was fully awake. Grace was sitting on the edge of her bed with both hands pressed flat against her sternum, her breathing shallow and rapid, her face the color of old ash. She looked up when he came through the door and said with considerable effort, "I think something's happening." He called 911 while already moving, grabbing her robe, getting to her side, keeping his voice level the way he'd kept his voice level 3 years ago on a different terrible night. He sat beside her and held her hand and talked to her steadily. Not about anything important, just steadily, so she had something to follow. Noah appeared in the doorway. Gray t-shirt, mismatched socks. He looked at Grace, then at his father, and went very still in the way children go still when they understand something serious is happening and have decided not to make it worse. Ava appeared behind him, half asleep. Noah put his arm around her and turned her gently away from the room. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Malik rode in the ambulance. Before he left, he gripped Noah's shoulder and told him he'd done good. Noah said, "Tell her we'll be here when she gets back." Both kids already knew, because Malik had made sure they understood in the plain, honest way he handled hard things with them. that Grace's heart was fragile and that nights like this might happen. Knowing didn't make it easier, but it meant they weren't blindsided. And it meant Noah could stand in that doorway and hold his sister and wait rather than fall apart. The waiting room at St. Grace at midnight looked different than it did in the daytime. Quieter. Smaller. The way spaces shrink when you're in them alone and afraid. Malik sat in a plastic chair against the wall and did not look at his phone. He had already given the paramedics Grace's full medication list. Already called her doctor. Already done every practical thing there was to do. Now there was only the waiting. And the waiting had a quality he recognized. The same suspended, airless quality of the hours after Renee's accident when the doctors were still talking about what might be possible. He sat with that for a long time. He had told himself, when Grace first moved in, that he had made peace with uncertainty, that he understood what he was walking into. That love was worth the cost of loss. Sitting in that waiting room at 12:40 in the morning, he was less certain. Not about Grace. Never about Grace. But about whether he was strong enough to go through this again. To sit in these chairs. To talk to doctors in corridors. To hold someone's hand through something that couldn't be stopped. He thought about Renee. About how she had been in the last hours. The particular quality of her stillness. The way the room had felt afterward. Emptied of something that couldn't be named. He thought about how he had driven home from this very hospital 3 years ago and walked into a house that had the same furniture and the same walls and was completely different from the house he had left that morning. He thought, I cannot do this again. And then, in the same breath, he thought, but I am already in it. And I would not have it any other way. At 2:15, a doctor came out and told him Grace was stable. Acute decompensation caught early enough. Medication adjustment. 48 hours of monitoring. She was asking for him. Malik stood. His legs felt unreliable, but they held. She was in a room on the 3rd floor. Different from 319, but similar enough. Same fluorescent light. Same beeping machine. Same whiteness of everything. He sat in the chair beside her and took her hand. Grace looked at him and said, I'm sorry I scared you. Don't apologize for still being here, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Noah and Ava are home with our neighbor Sandra. Noah told me to tell you they'll be there when you get back. Something moved across Grace's face. Not quite a smile, but close. He's a good kid, she said. He is, Malik said. The room settled into quiet. The machine beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past. Then Grace said, I was so scared. I know. Not of dying, she said. Of leaving before. She stopped. Tried again. I kept thinking in the ambulance about Ava's sunflower drawings. That I wouldn't get to see what she draws next year. That Noah's going to read a book someday that I would have loved, and I won't be there to argue with him about it. She paused. That's new for me. Wanting things forward. I didn't used to have anything to want forward. Malik held her hand and said nothing, because nothing he could say would improve on what she'd just told him. Don't let me become careful again after this, Grace said. Don't let me start pulling back because I got scared. I won't, he said. Promise me. I promise you. She closed her eyes. He stayed until she was asleep, and then sat a while longer in the chair beside her bed, in the hospital where he had walked into the wrong room 9 months ago, and thought about what it meant to choose something fully, knowing the full cost, and choose it anyway. He thought it might be the bravest thing he had ever done. He thought about Renee, about what she would have made of all this, of Grace, of the sunflower drawings on the refrigerator, of the stories Grace told the kids before bed, of the way the house had started to sound different. He knew what Renee would have said. She would have said it directly, probably in the kitchen over coffee, and she would have told him that being happy was not the same as forgetting, and that loving someone new was not a betrayal of loving her. She had been that kind of person, clear-eyed, generous, unwilling to let the people she loved shrink themselves out of guilt. He drove home in the early morning dark and found Noah asleep on the couch, waiting. Grace came home 4 days later. She was quieter in the first week back, careful with herself physically, moving slowly, resting during the hours the kids were at school. But she wasn't pulling back. She kept her promise and Malik kept his. And the house settled back into its rhythm, noisier than it had been a year ago, fuller, imperfect in the way that living with people is always imperfect and better for it. 3 weeks after she came home, on a Sunday evening when the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, Grace told him the truth about the day they met. They were sitting on the back porch. Early April. Still cool. Winter not quite finished. Malik had coffee and Grace had tea, and the light in the yard was going the way spring light goes. Gently, without hurry. I need to tell you something, Grace said, about the day you walked into my room. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the yard. That morning, when the nurse came in with my medication, I asked her how long it would take if I stopped taking everything. She paused. She thought I was asking about the adjustment period. I wasn't. Malik was very still. I had decided, Grace said. I was going to stop. Stop taking the pills, stop eating, stop pushing. I was tired of being sick and tired of being alone, and I couldn't see the point of continuing to fight for a result that wasn't going to change. Her voice was steady, but only barely. And then you walked in. The yard was quiet. A bird somewhere nearby. The neighbor's wind chimed turning slowly. You walked in and you sat down, Grace said. You talked to me like I was a person, not a patient, not a case. You told me about Ava and the socks, and I laughed, and I thought, I'll decide tomorrow. Just one more day. She turned her cup in her hands. And then you came back, and you brought soup you didn't make. And then Noah and Ava came, and one day became a week, and a week became a month, and at some point I stopped counting. Back and started counting forward. Malik set down his cup. You didn't just find me, Grace said. You came in at the exact moment I needed someone to come in. I didn't save you, Malik said. You did, Grace said. No, he said. I walked into the wrong room because I was exhausted and couldn't read the signs right. I sat down because something you said reminded me of something I'd lost. Everything after that. He shook his head. You saved yourself. Every morning for 9 months you chose to still be here. Grace looked at him. But I'll tell you what you saved, Malik said. He gestured toward the house, toward the light in the kitchen window, toward the sound of the house settling around them. I was surviving, taking care of my kids, paying my bills, getting through each day. I told myself that was enough, that it was all I needed and all I deserved. He paused. You made me want more than surviving. I didn't know I still could. Grace reached across the small table and put her hand over his. They sat like that as the last of the light left the yard. Two people who had both been quietly disappearing before they found each other. Now simply, stubbornly here. Spring became summer. Summer stretched and slowed the way summers do when something good is happening and you don't want it to end. Grace's health stabilized in a way her doctors described as encouraging without making promises. Her heart was still damaged and would stay damaged. She still had bad days. Still had medications she couldn't miss. Still had a future with an asterisk attached. None of that changed. What changed was the way she moved through the house. The ease of it. The way she called from the kitchen to ask who wanted eggs. The way she sat at the table with her reading glasses on and marked up Noah's book reports with a red pen and handed them back with comments in the margins. Specific, pointed, comments that made Noah read them twice and quietly revise his conclusions. The way she and Ava had developed an elaborate handshake that Malik had been trying to learn for 2 months and still couldn't get right, which both of them found deeply satisfying. What changed was the way Malik laughed. Fully. The way he used to. What changed was everything that didn't announce itself. In September, on a Saturday morning, Malik told the kids he needed to run an errand and asked if they wanted to come. Ava said yes without looking up. Noah, 9 now and developing opinions about his time, asked where they were going. The hospital, Malik said. Noah put his shoes on without further comment. He and Ava had spoken to Malik together 2 weeks earlier in the serious, deliberate way they sometimes coordinated when something mattered to them. They had told him simply that they wanted Grace to stay. Not as a guest, not as someone they were helping, but as theirs. Permanently. Officially. In whatever way that was possible. Noah had said, we already know she's family. We just want her to know we know. Malik had listened to his son and said he understood completely. They drove to St. Grace. Malik had called ahead and arranged with the charge nurse. He'd asked Grace only to trust him, which she did, and she sat quietly in the car with her hands in her lap, watching the city pass. They walked through the front entrance, past the elevator, past the water fountain, past the cart of folded blankets in the corridor. They took the stairs to the 3rd floor. They walked down the hall to room 319. It was occupied, so they stood in the doorway. The room was visible. The bed by the window, the empty chair beside it, the small nightstand. Grace looked at it for a long moment. Then she felt Malik move beside her, and she looked down and found him on one knee in the corridor of St. Grace Hospital. And Ava, who had been holding the secret for 3 weeks through an extraordinary act of willpower for a 6-year-old, made a sound that was half gasp and half cheer and covered her mouth with both hands. The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a small diamond, bought over 4 months of careful saving. Malik held it up and looked at Grace and said, "A year ago, I walked into the wrong room. I have spent every day since then thinking it was the luckiest wrong turn I ever made." He swallowed. "I want you to be my wife. I want you to be Noah and Ava's mother, officially, in every way that matters. I want us to keep going, however long we get, whatever it looks like, together." He looked up at her. Grace had both hands pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were full. "Will you marry me?" he said. She nodded before she found the words. Then she found them. "Yes, absolutely yes." Ava erupted completely. Noah, who had held himself together admirably until that precise moment, wiped his eye quickly with the back of his hand and looked at the ceiling as though he'd found something very interesting up there. A passing nurse stopped in the corridor. She looked at the scene, and she started clapping. 2 orderlies joined in. Grace laughed through her tears and shook her head at the absurdity of it all. And Malik stood up and put the ring on her finger and held her face in his hands. The wedding was small by design and perfect by accident. They held it in the garden behind a church 3 blocks from St. Grace Hospital on a Saturday in October, 11 months after Malik had walked into the wrong room. The light came in low through the trees. The air smelled like leaves and something about to change. There were 24 people, co-workers of Malik's, neighbors, 2 nurses from the 3rd floor, of St. Grace who had watched Grace go from a woman counting down to a woman planning forward, and who had asked with barely contained emotion if they could come. Noah wore a gray suit slightly too long in the sleeves. He had picked it himself and refused alterations on the grounds that he would grow into it, which was technically true. He carried the rings on a small velvet pillow with the gravity of someone performing a task of national importance. Ava wore a yellow dress chosen in approximately 45 seconds, which was how Ava made most decisions. Quickly, completely, without second-guessing. She had practiced her walk down the aisle approximately 30 times in the living room. When the actual moment came, she threw all the petals in one large, enthusiastic handful about 15 feet before the altar, looked at the empty basket, looked at the remaining aisle, and walked the rest of the way with complete dignity, as though this had been the plan. Grace stood at the edge of the garden in a simple white dress she had altered herself at the kitchen table in the evenings while the kids watched television. It fit her perfectly. She was still thin the way she had been since the hospital, but there was color in her face and steadiness in how she stood. And when she began to walk toward Malik, she was not leaning on anyone. Malik watched her come toward him and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. They had written their own vows, which neither had shared with the other beforehand, and which turned out to share a theme without having been coordinated. The idea that none of this had gone the way it was supposed to, and that this was precisely why they trusted it. Malik said, "I didn't choose the right door. I didn't even choose to stay. I just couldn't leave. And everything after that has been the best decision I never made on purpose." Grace said, "I spent my whole life believing I wasn't someone people stay for. You stayed, and then you came back, and then you brought your children, and now I'm standing here, which is something I genuinely did not expect to be doing, and I am so grateful I was wrong about myself." Noah, standing beside his father, gave a single solemn nod as though this confirmed something he had known for some time. The officiant pronounced them married. Malik kissed his wife. Ava cheered loud enough to startle the birds in the nearby trees, who lifted briefly into the October sky and then settled back down the way things do after a moment of joy. Not gone, just rearranged. After the wedding, life continued in the way life continues. Not transformed overnight. Not made simple, but inhabited more fully. Grace officially became Grace Johnson, though she kept Whitmore as a middle name. Noah began calling her mom Grace one evening in November in the middle of asking her to check his math homework. The way you say a word you've been practicing, carefully at first, and then with relief when it comes out right. Grace checked his homework and corrected 2 problems and didn't make a thing of it, which was exactly right. Ava had been calling her mom since August. No ceremony. Just one morning at breakfast asking if Mom could make the eggs with the cheese mixed in. Grace had made the eggs. Malik had looked at his coffee cup for a moment. And then the three of them had eaten breakfast together in the ordinary, irreplaceable way of people who belong to each other. Grace's health held through the winter. There was one overnight hospital stay in January. Precautionary. And she came through it with less fear than the time before and more practice. Her cardiologist used the phrase stable trajectory at her February follow-up, which was not a promise, but was something. She began volunteering at St. Grace on Thursday afternoons, going to the third floor, checking with the charge nurse for patients who hadn't had visitors, knocking on their doors to ask if she could sit for a while. Some said no. Most said yes. She brought nothing but herself and the willingness to stay. She did it because she knew what a room felt like when no one came. She did it because someone had once walked into a room by accident and stayed on purpose. She did it because she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that you do not need to be saved by something grand. Sometimes a person just needs someone willing to pull up a chair. On a Sunday evening in late November, Malik stood on the back porch and watched his family in the yard below. Grace was teaching Ava a more detailed sunflower. Layered petals. Shaded center. Ava's tongue was pressed to her lower lip in concentration. Noah sat on the steps nearby with a book, occasionally looking up to observe the lesson with the quiet interest of someone who had decided not to participate but didn't want to miss anything. Malik held his coffee and watched them. 11 months. That was all it had been from a wrong door to a life he hadn't known he was still allowed to want. He thought about the tired man he'd been, walking through that hospital with his son's medical folder, turning left when he should have turned right. He thought about the woman in room 319 who had been counting down and had stopped, one day at a time, until counting forward became the only direction she knew. He thought about what Noah had once said, that sometimes you have to walk toward the sad thing instead of away from it. He thought about what Grace had said on the porch that April evening. That one day became a week, and a week became a month, and at some point she stopped counting back and started counting forward. He thought about Ava's drawing, still on the refrigerator under the pineapple magnet. 5 figures. One in a bed with a red blanket and a careful crayon smile, drawn by a 5-year-old who had understood something the adults in the room were still working out. That if some doesn't have anybody, you can become their anybody. Below him, Grace looked up and found him on the porch. She smiled. Not the contained, careful smile of a woman keeping herself at a safe distance, but the full one. The one that had taken months to come all the way out. He raised his coffee cup. She turned back to the sunflower lesson. Some doors you don't choose. You just stop being afraid to walk through them. Malik didn't save Grace. Grace didn't save Malik. They just stayed. For 5 minutes that became 50. For one day that became a year. For a life that neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. The biggest things in life rarely arrive announced. They come through wrong turns, misread signs, and doors that open when you're too tired to be careful. The question is never whether the moment will come. The question is whether you'll be willing to pull up a chair and stay. If you've ever taken a wrong turn that led you somewhere right, or if you know someone who needed to hear that it's not too late to start counting forward, remember this story. You are not invisible. Someone will walk through the door, and sometimes that someone is you.